This lesson is called Graphing Stories because we make use of a website called Graphing Stories, and it's at graphingstories.com. I'll leave that for you guys to check out on your own if you're so inclined. But the point of the lesson is to remind us that when we're graphing things, when we're writing equations, when we're making tables of values, it's all about relationships between two variables, right? There's always two variables for everything we've been working on that that we're just seeing the relationship between them. Usually we represent it with x and y. But it could be other variables like C and H for cost versus hours or something like that. Anyway, so here's the website, graphingstories.com, but here is the OneNote lesson. As you can see, what I've got up here is just, again, this is something that we use in class normally, but it's just a grid where you could watch this graphingstories.com. They tell a little story, and then you're supposed to draw a graph to represent it. So rather than do that, I'm just going to make one up just to explain the concept to you. Let's imagine that we wanted to have a graph comparing how high you are. You're climbing a tree, right? Or maybe your nephew who's 10 years old is climbing a tree. So we want to graph time, which would be our independent variable. We've seen that before. And then climbing the tree, we want to compare that to how high your nephew has climbed. All right, so maybe time, seconds, well, that's a bit short. So for this example I'm inventing here, let's make it time in minutes. And so your nephew's climbing the tree, and let's say he's a little bit of a monkey, and he's a pretty good climber. So he climbs, and when you visualize a tree, of course, the idea is you're basically going straight up. So you might think that, oh, well, my graph needs to sort of go like this. But of course, that would be if I was graphing how high he's going compared to how high how far he's going side to side. But that's not what we're graphing here. What we're graphing is how high he is compared to how much time has gone by. So let's, again, we're just going to play with this for just a few seconds to give you the idea. So let's say you start your watch, and then he stands there for a second, and because he's nervous, and he doesn't climb, so he stands there actually for a couple minutes. Let's say for 2 minutes he's nervous and won't start climbing the tree. Well, time is still going by, so it goes a little bit over to the right, and he hasn't gotten any higher. Then he gets his nerve up, he starts climbing, he climbs up at a steady rate, and let's say that the steady rate looks something like this, okay? So, again, more time is going by, so between 2 minutes and 5 minutes, right, this distance here, he's been climbing at a steady rate. That was supposed to be a little brackety thing. And then now he's getting kind of high. Like, I didn't put a scale on here, but let's say that this is 20, 40, 60, 80 feet. He's getting pretty high now. And he's getting nervous. The branches are getting thinner, and he's just high up off the ground. He's kind of scared, so he starts to slow down. But he still goes at a steady rate, but he's going slower. Well, how's that going to look? Well, he's still going up. Time's still going by, but it's not going to be as steep. All right? Now, this is just a make-believe thought experiment here, so let's pretend that at the bottom of the tree you've got a bunch of firemen with one of those catchy things, and so your nephew sees them and he jumps right out of the tree and just shoots right down the 120 feet or so into the fireman's net. Well, dropping, he's not going to drop straight down because, again, that's time going by, that horizontal thing. He's going to drop very quickly, of course, due to gravity, but what he's going to do is he might drop something like this. Actually, even that's a bit too much, because starting from here and then going over to this line, that would be about, each line is 1 minute, the way I've made the scale, right? So that means it's taking at least 30 seconds for it once he jumps from to hit the ground. Well, that's maybe a bit much. So maybe if I'm trying to be accurate, maybe it should be more like something like this. Definitely moving over to the right a little bit, but going down very quickly because he's falling. But then he lands in the net with a big smile and he's all happy. So it's got a happy ending. That's the idea of what we're talking about for graphing stories. So There's two variables, and if it's time for one of them, you got to remember that time's always moving forward. So you have to visualize it's not an up and down and strictly up and down, not side to side thing, but it's time versus height. So you got to get that sort of clear in your own mind. So they got a bunch of ideas like that on graphing stories. They've got height of waist off the ground for this one on the right hand side. So someone goes up a slide and comes down, that's a time thing. Bum height off the ground on the far left one, someone on those big slides. Distance from the bench for pressing a barbell up and down, and so on. So feel free to play with those. But aside from that, here's some examples of some ones already done up. Below the following graphs are 3 stories about walking from your locker to class. The good old days. All right. 2 of the stories correspond to the graphs, match the stories and the graphs. Okay, so here are 4 graphs, and then here are the stories below them. So we want to read these stories and see if any of these graphs look like what we would imagine the story should be. I started to walk to class, but I realized I had forgotten my notebook, so I went back to my locker and then went quickly at a constant rate to class. So if I start at the top left, what we have here is time, of course, and distance from locker, how far the student has gotten from his or her locker. Well, what is this first one showing? It's showing that someone has started from their locker and then walked at a constant distance away from their locker. In this graph, they're never coming back. They just keep walking away from their locker. So that doesn't match up with our first story. The second story, again, it's time and distance. Someone's walking away from their locker, and then we got this flat spot. What do you think that means? Well, we saw that in the example I made up before. Flat spot, when we're doing the time, means someone's standing still. And then they start moving faster. Maybe they're late for class, maybe they're running. That doesn't match up with the story that we just talked about either, though, so we won't go with that one. Here's one where someone walks away from their locker, and then they turn around, it seems, and come back to their locker, and then they head off again. That, to me, seems to match up with the walk to class, forgot my notebook, went back, and then went at a constant rate to class. So I think that's going to be, our answer is going to be C for this one. But let's just look at D just to make sure. What is this one showing us? It looks like someone's on their way very quickly. They're running, but then they slow down. So they're still moving towards class. It's still going up, so they're still getting closer to class, farther from their locker anyway. But it's getting slower. So it's like they sprinted, and then they got tired and gradually slowed down. But in this one, they never come back either. So again, that doesn't match number 1. Number 2, I was rushing to get to class when I realized I wasn't late, so I slowed down a bit. Well, that pretty much describes what I just said for number D, or letter D. Running, slowing down, I think that one would work. I started walking at a steady rate. This is number 3. Slow, constant to class. Then I realizing I was late, I ran the rest of the way at a steady, faster rate. So that could be B, because someone is walking. It looks like this is walking to class. And then here's someone that looks like they're running to class. But there's 2 things wrong with this. First of all, the thing said that that only 2 of the stories matched up, and we've already matched our 2 up. The other thing is that story I just read didn't say anything about stopping, and remember this means stopping. So there's no stopping happening here. So for number 3, if I want to draw a graph, I'm doing this a bit out of order, but that's okay. So if this is what my grid looks like, and we got time on the bottom, distance on the side. So walking at a slow, steady rate to class. Oops, my hand slipped. And then running the rest of the way would be like this, without that stop in between. As for coming up for stories for the other 2, we still haven't done B or A. Well, I described B. Walked, stopped, ran. That would be, just in some key words, what happened. Walked, then stopped, then ran. Those 3 sections. And this one just walked at a steady rate. And that's it for this little lesson.